The number one thing that is missed when it comes to using historical investment returns to project it in the future. I'm going to share that with you here today. As I was reading my man Jim Otar, O-T-A-R, and I'm a huge fan of this guy. He probably is the first person I read that take on Monte Carlo and some of the issues that comes with Monte Carlo. Trust me, I've been in financial planning a long time, and a lot of people say the Monte Carlo shows that you have 100% likelihood of success, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, and people take that as if it's written in the Bible. God's spoken word. And nothing could be further from the truth. The Monte Carlo is just basic on two things: your average rate of return and standard deviation. That's it. Well, where do you get that numbers from? Well, are we getting it from the last 40 years? Are we getting it from the last 80 years? Well, we don't have any international exposure since about, the 70s. So 40 years of international stocks, maybe 50 years of small cap stocks. We got 10-year treasury bonds and large cap domestic stocks. That's it. So we're using that, projecting going forward. S&P 500, yeah, you can make an argument. It's been around since 1871. I mean, you can make an argument there is stock market, but how many people are actually in the stock market since 1871? Not very many people. You have some railroad companies, that's it. Certainly not the vast majority of us are invested in the stock market in 1871. 1926. Okay, that's kind of the modern era, but again, we even have small cap stocks, international stocks, corporate, junk bonds, all that until the last 40 years or so. So I was reading my man Jim Otar, and he said, look, if we have 100 years, it's time to take the guessing out of retirement planning. I'm like, but I don't even like that, because we have no idea. You can't. So the insinuation was, this is guessing, this is definitive. And I'm like, but that's not true. And I'm going to share with you a perfect example of this here in just a second. And I like Jim. I like most of these guys. So I'm sitting there thinking, but you're insinuating that this is likely to happen or that you can count on it. And you just can't. You can't. So let's go back into the stock market and returns. And we're going to look at two things. We're going to look at inflation, and we're going to look at investment returns. All right. So we have a quadrant, and this will remind you of my quadrant to know if you can retire successfully just by looking at this quadrant. So here we got high inflation, low inflation, high returns, low returns. All right, so we have basically three, and if you want to look at the 1900s, the latter part of the 19th century, we can do this as well. But let's going to go and kind of connect the dots here. So let's get a different pen here. We got a good purple. Ooh, that's look good. We got orange too. Ooh, that might look good too. So let's try orange. All right, so based in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, we had high returns and low inflation. 1890s, all right? That's what we had. High returns, low inflation. Actually, you had deflation back then. So when I say low inflation, it might be deflation. All right, so then we go into the World War I period. We had okay returns and high inflation, but that was only for a couple periods of times. Basically, I'm looking for like a sustainable time frame, the Great Depression, for instance. So the Great Depression, we had low inflation and low returns. All right, so this is depression. Is that right? We got low inflation and low returns right here. Depression. Sorry. There we go. There you go. So the Great Depression, we had low inflation and low returns. They're in the Great Depression. During the 1890s, we had high returns and low inflation. That's good. That's what you want, high returns and low inflation. All right. From 1966, I hate to even say 1966, but basically 1966 to 1982, we had high inflation and medium returns. Right? 1966 to 1982, high returns. And the returns were okay. They weren't bad. All right, they weren't bad. They weren't going to say high, but they're middling. All right, so basically, from a price perspective, you didn't make any money, but you didn't get hammered. In 1966, you lost about 11%. 73 and 74, you got hammered, and in 1974, 77 or 78, you lost a little bit. But that's it. You had 4 down years. Only 2 were anything big. That's 73, 74. But from basically 1966 to 1982, you actually made a little bit of money. Dividends reinvested. So you weren't high returns, but they weren't low returns. They were okay, but they weren't negative returns by any stretch of the imagination. 73, 74, you had high returns high inflation. And again, you had 2 years that were bad, but if you survived those 2 years, which you did, you went into a pretty freaking awesome ride from basically 1975, basically from 1982 to 2000. You had high returns. But basically from 1973, and you didn't even really have, and I'd even say this right here, I probably should redo that one because, in fact, 1966, so the 60s, they weren't that bad. So the returns were 1966 to 1982 were not great returns, but they weren't huge inflation until the 70s either. And then we had high returns, high inflation when we started in 1973 and 74. So, yeah, it was a bad decade, the 70s, but the beginning of the 70s, inflation wasn't through the roof, and the returns weren't that bad. I mean, they weren't great, but they weren't negative by any stretch of imagination. And that's basically the only times we really had any significant, time frame. We had 1890s, we had high returns, low inflation. All right, we had the Great Depression, we had low returns, low inflation. 73, 74, again, if you survived those 2 years, and you did, most likely, going into 82, you were fine. I'm telling you, I've run so many different things, but that was a challenge, 73, 74. High returns, high inflation after you survived these 2 years. 66 to 82 time period, we had high inflation, moderate inflation initially, lower returns initially, but not negative by any stretch of imagination. So that kind of fell in the middle here. And then we had the aughts, which was lower inflation. So the aughts, the 2000s would be here. Probably 2000s would be actually kind of up here a little bit. Lower returns and lower inflation. Now, the one thing you'll see, we haven't had anything on this side of negative returns by any stretch. Nothing with high inflation. Nothing here. And that's the drawback. And again, I want to point out, when I say high returns in 1973 and 74, 73 and 74 were not high returns. I'm telling you. However, you survived those 2 years. You went on a pretty good run from basically 75 until 1999. You had good returns, but you had high inflation to contend with. The one thing we haven't had is negative returns and high inflation. We haven't had that ever. So, again, we've had it for a couple years in 1973 and 74. That's 2 years. That's it. That's not a cycle. That's not a secular cycle for investing. That's just 2 years. In any given 2 year time frame, we could pick up anything. I'm just saying for retirement plan. The closest thing we would have is 1966 to 1982, when we had middling returns beginning to be high inflation and then high inflation through the 70s. That's it. But we haven't had anything with significant negative returns, just below zero with high inflation. Nothing. So for those if you want to use Monte Carlo, if you want to use the historical years, the 30-year rolling time frames, you got 120 of those events from 1870 through 2020. You got about 119, 120 rolling 30-year time frames, which has a lot of correlation there anyway, which I don't like. All that. So Jim would say, well, we have all this evidence from the last 100 years, but we don't have anything right here. So just because it hasn't happened, does that mean it can't? Well, that's just silly. Of course it could. So for someone to sit there and say, well, it hasn't happened in the past, thus this is definitive, you'll be okay. Well, you can't do that, man. You can't allow the assumption that says this happened in the past, so you're safe. We have this big hole right here of low returns. When I say low returns, I'm talking negative returns and high inflation. When I'm talking high inflation, I'm talking 7-8%. We have no evidence of that whatsoever, no experience whatsoever of that. Could that happen? Sure, man. Absolutely. Low returns, the valuation of stocks, for instance, are high. Debt's through the roof. You know what I'm saying? The Fed just says they want inflation without question. They're willing to have low interest rates to get inflation. They're okay with that. We have government, just freaking, these government stimulus checks. All kinds of reasons you could expect inflation. What if we have price controls in Nixon time? We have Arab oil embargo. That's not going to be an issue here, but what could be the next one? I actually say would be the supply chain for food. What if that happens? And you got huge, and then you got Grid going down, you got hyperinflation on energy. What if we go some stupid solar photovoltaic and get rid of fossil fuels? That's hyperinflation on electricity, on energy. We have no natural gas pipelines in the Northeast. We got supply chains going down. You're going to have high inflation for sure, hyperinflation even. And of course, what happens then is some stupid Democrat will say, "Oh, we're going to have price controls." And price controls only exasperate inflation. It makes things scarce. More scarce, the more inflation it is. That's all there is to it. And then on top of that, you have local returns too, because high corporate taxes, high income taxes, high regulation, all that. That could easily come. And if that comes, let's just write this down. Future. What does your retirement plan look like then? Something to be concerned yourself with, for sure. So I'm going to focus a lot on that going forward, because I do think this has a potential. I am not convinced that our supply chain is back to even Steven. I'm not at all. I'm not convinced at all our grid is stable. I'm not at all. I'm not convinced that we're not going to have a crazy quasi-Marxist government that's run not even by the elected politicians, but it's run by nameless bureaucrats, essentially the public health authorities that we're seeing across the freaking country right now. They're basically authoritarian and telling people how to live. I think what we've gone through with the commie virus and then the insane riots are showing that the country isn't as established as we had thought. So we better be prepared for low returns and high inflation. And if we don't get it, that's great. But what if we do? But Josh, that's never happened in the history of mankind, in the history of America. Man, we got freaking 40 years of, like I said, 50 years of international small cap stocks. That's it. Junk bonds going back to 1980s with Michael Milken. That's it. Leveraged buyouts, LBOs. We have 40 years of junk bonds. That's it, man. Never mind derivatives and all this stuff. Man, it's a crazy world, man. It's a brave new world. You better be prepared. All right, so we'll talk about more, but I want to point that out to you to get you thinking. I'd like to hear your thoughts. All right, we'll see you.